Is that the bill be now read a second time, and I call Opposition Spokesperson Gareth Davies.
Madam Deputy Speaker, congratulations on your election to the chair. And Madam Deputy Speaker, let me take this as my first opportunity to congratulate the Honourable and Right Honourable gentleman opposite, the new Treasury ministerial team. They've taken up some of the best jobs in government. I loved every minute of my time in the Treasury, even when I had to come to this place to face my shadows. And I will always be grateful to the officials who supported me and the team so ably. And as the Member of Parliament for Grantham, the home of our country's first female Prime Minister, I congratulate our country's first female Chancellor. It is right that we highlight that. While the two are not politically aligned, we can all recognise when a ceiling has been shattered, and no matter who is breaking it, and we certainly recognise that on this side of the House. Madam Deputy Speaker, the bill before us today seeks to amend the Budget Responsibility and National Audit Act of 2011, a bill introduced by a Conservative Chancellor and which created the Office for Budget Responsibility. The bill should be understood in that context, building on a previous bill which replaced a system where His Majesty's Treasury would produce its own forecasts and the Chancellor of the Exchequer would essentially mark their own homework. Back then, this was an essential piece of legislation, given what had gone on before. Between 2000 and 2010, the then Labour government, their so-called forecasts for growth in the economy were out by an average of £13 billion. Their forecasts for the budget deficit 3 years ahead were out by an average £40 billion. Their forecasts therefore lacked any credibility at all. And it wasn't just the forecasts which led to the creation of the OBR, it was the management of the economy. Much has already been said by the Shadow Chancellor about higher inflation, higher deficit and higher unemployment the Conservatives inherited from Labour in 2010. But what is sometimes forgotten is that total public spending accounted for almost half of the national income when Labour last left office. Welfare spending ballooned by a staggering 45%, and this runaway spending meant that we inherited the largest budget deficit of any economy in Europe, with the sole exception of one country, and that was Ireland. And so the idea, Madam Deputy Speaker, that Labour have an unblemished record when it comes to the public finances is just plain wrong. We Conservatives created the OBR in part to guard against Labour's fiscal unaccountability and recklessness with the public finances. We continue to support the role of the OBR in providing open, fully transparent, independent forecasts for all to see, no matter who is in government. And what was good to hear, genuinely good to hear, was the Chancellor recognised the importance of the OBR when she said that because of the OBR, in her words, you don't need to win an election to find out the state of the public finances. She was absolutely right about that. That's why, Madam Deputy Speaker, yesterday's supposed revelations just simply won't wash. In fact, she's so supportive of the OBR. If she is so supportive of the OBR, I ask a simple question. Why was yesterday's statement based on Treasury analysis and not OBR analysis? Surely if they're very supportive of the OBR, they would have asked the OBR to conduct that analysis, not internal Treasury analysis. The OBR have always said that they would be ready to produce analysis any time on short notice. But Madam Deputy Speaker, look, that was yesterday. And today we're here to talk about the bill in front of us right now. While we're supportive of the OBR, we think it is right that the House needs to consider a number of concerns we have that we'll be seeking clarification from the government on. Firstly, the bill will require the Treasury to request and the OBR to produce a report on fiscally significant measures announced by the government, with the exception of temporary emergency measures. The definitions of these terms, fiscally significant, temporary and emergency, will be set out in the Charter for Budget Responsibility, as the Chief Secretary outlined. The draft Charter text, published alongside this bill, deems measures to be fiscally significant if they cost the equivalent of 1% of GDP in any financial year. It defines as temporary any measure intended to end within 2 years. And the draft charter text gives the OBR discretion to reasonably disagree with the Treasury's interpretation of what constitutes emergency. Given some of the rhetoric around this bill, we note that nowhere in this bill or the surrounding documents is the OBR actually empowered to prevent a government from taking fiscally significant action of any kind. The effect of this bill is to ensure that an OBR costing accompanies any fiscal significant action a government takes, nothing more, nothing less. Some of the way the Chancellor described this bill as being a so-called lock to prevent certain activity is, if I was being generous on my first outing, overly ambitious. The bill is described as introducing a fiscal lock which the Chancellor promises will prevent large-scale unfunded commitments. It's just not what this bill does, though. There is no fiscal lock. If anything, it's a forecast lock. The potential impact of this bill is limited, so limited, actually, so specific as to leave some to wonder whether, for all the animated hyperbole of the Chancellor yesterday, this is prioritisation of gimmicks over governing, despite what the Prime Minister said at the King's speech. I will in a moment. Secondly, and as I say this, I say it genuinely constructively, the government needs to be better prepared to clarify what is meant by emergency. The draft charter gives the OBR the power to reasonably disagree with the government's interpretation of what is or not an emergency. But this raises questions around whether the OBR is equipped in the first place to make such a decision. What counts as an emergency should mostly be clear-cut. But what about instances that are less obvious, unforeseen circumstances that will come down the track? The OBR would then be straying into political decision-making, which would rightly raise constitutional issues. Even if, ultimately, it is for ministers to decide on such matters, any resulting disagreement between the government and the OBR on whether the circumstances amount to emergency could undermine the credibility of the government, the OBR, or both. Thirdly and finally, in the event the lock is argued.
I thank the Minister for giving way because I'm genuinely perplexed. I can't understand whether the Shadow Minister is with his former colleague, the South West Norfolk member who wanted to see the OBR abolished and not part of any of our decision making, or doesn't feel that this piece of legislation goes far enough. Either way, does he recognise and accept, as thousands of mortgage payers in this country now do, the disaster of the previous Conservative Prime Minister's budget and the impact it's had and the need never to go back to those days?
Madam Deputy Speaker, we support the OBR. I've been clear on that. We created the OBR. So to suggest that we don't support the OBR is incorrect. But I would just pull her up on some economic facts. The reason interest rates were so high and mortgages went up is because we faced a global challenge which this government will now experience. In office, you have to deal with events. And what caused inflation around the world was two things. It was the war in Ukraine, which pushed up gas prices. Wholesale gas prices reached record highs. And secondly, the fallout from the pandemic, a once-in-a-century pandemic, which the party opposite seem to have forgotten about. And so those two factors resulted in 11% inflation, which resulted in my, at the time, Chancellor and Prime Minister prioritising bringing down inflation, which we did, to 2%. And we've now handed this government 2% inflation, half the deficit we inherited in 2010, half the unemployment, and the fastest growth in the G7. So the suggestion that we need to take lessons from the party opposite on economic performance, I think, is a little rich. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, a third and final concern that we have, and we have others, but I'm keeping it short given its second reading. In the event the lock is triggered, the OBR does not need to produce one of its standard reports, even though the Treasury, under this bill, is required to request such a report to avoid breaking the lock. The bill, therefore, creates the possibility of an entirely new OBR report, which is not envisaged by the original Act. And I'd be grateful to the Minister if he could explain this and what it actually means in practice when he sums up this debate. While standard OBR reports must be published, it is not clear whether this applies to other reports the OBR may prepare. If this requirement does not apply, is the government happy to give the OBR the power to decide whether or not its costings are published? This is potentially very concerning when it comes to transparency. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, the official opposition look forward to more detailed scrutiny of this bill and the practical implications of it. But be in no doubt, we support the OBR. We created it to bring in much needed transparency to our fiscal framework after years of fiscal folly and false promises by the Labour Party. But at the same time, let us not pretend that the OBR should be the ultimate judge of good policy, that nothing bad can happen under its watchful eye and nothing good can happen beyond its gaze. Labour knows this. It's precisely what they argued 15 years ago when we first debated this bill that led to the OBR's creation. Nor should it become too political. The OBR should be a referee, not a player, in the fight for fiscal accountability. In the end, we stand by the principle that the British people, through their elected representatives, should always have the deciding say on public policy. We look forward to debating this further in the months ahead. We will not be voting against this bill at second reading, and we look forward to the debate.